I'm going to call your name if you don't look at me. Our Lord was right in the middle of this mob. And this little lady got up. Can you picture? Now, let me have your mind. Let me capture your mind for a minute. The Bible says in Mark, it doesn't say it in Luke, it says in Mark that when she had heard that Jesus was coming, that means somebody told her. There's the soul winner. There's the human instrument. Somebody told her. She had heard that Jesus was coming. Now then, I'm sure she said, the Bible said she spent everything she had. She had spent all of her money on doctors. She had gone to every doctor and every clinic and every hospital, and nobody could heal her. And she'd given up, but one day she heard Jesus was coming through. Can you imagine how weak she must have been? But she planned to get up early that morning, and she got up early. It wasn't easy for her to get dressed, and she had to trudge her way down to the crowd. I wonder, when she got there, if she said, Where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? And somebody said, he's in the middle of that crowd. And she said, I'm going to get to him. Can you see this poor lady with trembling, weak hands and quivering knees as I've got to get to, and maybe 100,000 people, at least 25 or 30,000, all throng around Jesus. And she begins to make her way through. Pardon me, please. I wonder how many times she got knocked down. I wonder how many bruises she got. I wonder how many times she thought, I just can't make it, it seems, but I've got to make it. I've got to get through to Jesus. And she just said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Here's the sermon tonight. The sermon tonight, very few Christians ever really touch Jesus. Oh, you come to church, but very few touch Jesus. Oh, you say your prayers, but very few touch Jesus. Oh, you have your devotions, but very few. Listen, you know, not one fraction of percent of Christians' prayers ever really. I mean, God hears you and God answers sometimes. But I mean, you really get a hold of God. Listen, if I were you tonight, I'd say I'm going to be the kind of Christian who gets a hold of God. I'm going to walk with God. I'm going to know God. I'm going to touch Him. He touched me. Oh, He touched me. Oh, the joy that filled my soul. He touched me. He touched me. And He made me whole, the songwriter said. I'd say I'm going to touch Him. Listen, what I'm saying is this. I would, if I were you, and I did this years ago, I would make my experience with God reality and not just hearsay and not just something I get by proxy from a preacher on Sunday. I'd say I'm going to touch Him. I don't care what the price, I'm going to touch Him. I don't care how much I've got to fight, I'm going to touch Him. I don't care how many times I stumble, I'm going to touch Him. I'm going to be the kind of Christian that touches God when I pray, that walks with God and knows God and reaches God. This old sin-cursed, heart-sick world needs a generation of Christians who touch Him and press through. You won't do it easily, and she didn't. But she touched Him. It wasn't easy. I told the story one time here. I love to tell this story. This is one of the sweetest stories, and I think one of the funniest that I tell. But it's one of the sweetest stories. When I was in East Texas Baptist College in Marshall, Texas, we had a fellow enrolled in school. He was a fellow who was tongue-tied. Once again, I'm not sure what his impediment of speech was. As I said this morning, it may have been a northern accent or something not quite as bad. I'm not sure what it was. It may have been an Art Snyder accent. I'm not sure. But anyway, he enrolled in East Texas Baptist College. And he said, first day I met him, I said, what are you going to study? He said, I'm going to be a preacher. I'm going to be a preacher. That's the way he put it. I'm going to be a preacher. I'm going to be a preacher. And he came to school. And we all laughed at him. Gonna be a preacher. Forgive us. We were mean, like you. But we'd get in a little huddle, and he'd walk by, and we'd all start to snicker. We wouldn't let him know it, but we'd say, he's going to be a preacher. He's going to be a preacher. And somebody, what are you going to be? We'd ask him that just to hear him say it. What are you going to be? I'm going to be a preacher. That one I'm going to be. I'm going to be a preacher. And nobody took him seriously. One day we were all around a little huddle of people, a bunch of us preacher boys, and he was there too. And we're all around a huddle of people, and the prettiest girl on campus came by. I mean the campus queen. I mean the girl that everybody wanted to date. Well, all the boys did, but that everybody wanted to date. She was the prettiest thing on campus. And this tongue-tied fellow looked at her, and he said to me, he said, "Guess what I'm going to do? Guess what I'm going to do?" I said, I know what you're going to do. You're going to be a preacher. That's what you're going to do. No, I'm going to be a preacher. But he said, I'm going to marry her. And we laughed and laughed, and she heard him. And one of the fellows said, hey, guess who's going to marry you? He said, I'm going to marry you. That's what I'm going to marry you. Poor fellow couldn't talk plainly, and he couldn't even get a date, much less marry the prettiest girl on campus. And so he said, I won't marry her. I won't marry her. And he got alone and he began to rehearse this question. May I please have a date? May I please have a date? It may have been, may I have a date, please? But may I please have a date? And he started off alone. So I'm sure like this. May I please have a date? 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 He got to where he couldn't say but one sentence, and that was, may I please have a date. Everything else was, I'm going to marry her. That's what I'm going to do. But boy, he could say, may I please have a date, and bow like Lord Chesterfield. And so he went to her, and we didn't know he had done all this. And we knew the day he was going to ask her for a date. We didn't know he had done all this. And so he walked up, and we were hiding. We said, well, look what he's going to do. He's going to ask her for a date. He's going to marry her, you know. He walked up. You talk about a surprise a lot of people. He said, may I please have a date? We couldn't believe our ears. And the girl looked at him and said, what did you say? He said, may I please have a date? She said, Joe, say that again. May I please have a date? She said, did you learn that just to ask me for a date? He said, I'm doing in. I've been practicing for a long time. I'm doing in. May I please have a date? She said, you sure may have a date. And boy, we were all over in the corner looking and couldn't believe. And some of those poor guys that weren't married were drooling, you know. And the poor guy that couldn't talk plainly got the date. Why? Because he pressed through. He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. By the way, he married the gal. And he's a preacher now, too, by the way. But he married the gal. Now, I'm simply saying that this little lady, she said, I don't care if the crowd is big, and if I'm weak, and if I've been sick for 12 years, I'm going to touch him. He's the only hope I've got. And I've heard he can heal sick people. And I've heard just a touch of Jesus is all I need. And I'm going to press through, and press through she does. And she stumbles, and she gets hit, and she gets bruises, and she falls, but she keeps on. And she says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And blessed be God, it was done. I recall one day when the pastor's school was over here at First Baptist Church, I came down the alley. We had a wonderful pastor's school. And I recall a man, I looked in that door to see who was here, and one man was here by himself. And I listened, and he was kneeling here, and he was beating on the altar, and he said, oh God, I can't go home the same. I can't go home the same. Oh God, I can't go home the same. And I tiptoed out because he was begging for the power of God. And so I came back 30 minutes later, I guess, and this fellow was here at the altar. Old pastor's school had been over for hours, and he was beating on the altar, and he said, oh God, I can't go home the same. I can't go home the same. I can't go home the same. And I came back a while later. He stayed here for hours, and he was praying the same prayer, tears falling off his cheeks, and he was beating on the altar, and he was saying, oh God, I can't go home the same. I can't go home the same. I can't go home the same. Ah, boy. I walked down the alley and I said, there, boy, some people are going to get it next Sunday. There's a certain church in this world going to get it next Sunday, and that's what Christians ought to do. Listen. The world is right. We are too shallow. And the world is right. We are hypocrites often. And the world is right. We don't really have the real thing. The honest, simple truth is every person that knows God ought to say, I'm going to press through. I'm going to touch him. I'm not going to have something shallow. I'm not going to settle for hearsay Christianity and religion. I'm going to press through and I'm going to touch him. Like that lady in Luke chapter 18, verses 1 and following, who came to the judge. You recall the story. And she came to the judge and she said, Judge, avenge me of mine adversary. And the judge said, I can't. I've got a case after case already ahead of yours. But she said, Judge, a man has done me wrong. Avenge me of mine adversary. And the judge said, leave me alone. But she said, Judge, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. And this one preacher tells the story. And the judge told her, "Get out of here!" And she knocked on the door in the courtroom. "Judge, avenge my adversary." And the judge said, "Leave me alone!" And the judge left to go home that evening. He walked out the door, and at the door where he walked out, there was a little lady on the outside the door. Said, "Judge, avenge me mine adversary." He said, "Good night, you've been in my hair all day long. Leave me alone." He goes to wait on the bus. He gets to the bus stop, and the little lady's there, and she says, "Judge, avenge me mine adversary." He says, "Good night, everywhere I go, you're there. Leave me alone. Leave me alone." He gets on the bus. He rides home. She gets a taxi cab. He gets off the bus, a certain corner, and guess who's waiting for him? That little lady. She says, "Judge, avenge me mine adversary." "How did you get here?" "Doesn't matter, Judge. Avenge me mine adversary." And the judge said, "Leave me alone." He went home. And he goes and takes his shoes off, puts his house shoes on. You get that in the Greek if you read very, very carefully. Puts his house shoes on, sits down to read the Hammond Times, and he's reading an article against the First Baptist Church. And somebody knocks on the door.